RMC is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your retro gaming with their joysticks featuring genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery.
Hello Cave Dwellers, welcome into the cave for the third and final part of the Amiga 4000 Trash to Treasure series. We could easily have 4, 5 or even 6 parts to this series, but we're going to round it off today and I'll explain why at the end of this episode. In the meantime, we've got a huge amount to get on with. We're going to be recapping today, scrubbing and upgrading and seeing the machine in action, in its final form, ready to take on its new lease of life here in the cave. And incredibly, we're also speaking to Dave Haney, the former senior engineer at Commodore, who will share with us his memories of creating the machine and the culture of Commodore at the time. A lot to get through, so let's fire up the soldering iron and get stuck straight in with that recapping.
Let's whip off those old caps then. They're known for being the extra leaky kind on the Amiga 4000 and are scheduled to fail any minute now. This board, if I'm honest, really isn't in bad condition at all, but I will give it a quick clean with some isopropyl alcohol. But not too much, given that the event around the world right now has seen the price of IPA skyrocket. I was lucky enough to have a couple of litres in stock before all of that happened. Now, as the Vata battery on the board had started to leak before we cut it out, I paid careful attention to the traces in that area on both sides of the board, especially around the RAM. In the longer term, it will be prudent to replace these RAM sockets, and that will also give us a chance to look for corrosion that's hidden that I can't see under those sockets. But for now, it's fine for testing, and if it's all good, then they will get that full service in the longer term. Now, as these are mostly surface mounted capacitors, with just a couple of through-hole ones, I will be using hot air to remove them. And that means protecting any components that might be damaged by the air with some carefully placed Kapton tape. And my approach to removing them is to dab on some flux. I favour flux paste, but liquid flux is just as good. A little on each pad to help the solder turn molten when the heat is applied. Even if that pad has started to corrode or has impurities on it, the flux will really help with that. And then we heat the pads on either side of the capacitor until the solder turns molten and the cap slides off without any force. Any force at all when pulling these off can result in ripping the pad off the board if it's damaged, although if corrosion has been eaten away at it, sometimes that's just unavoidable and repairs or patch wires are needed. Thankfully, even around the area of the battery leak, they all came off beautifully, with the air set to 360 degrees C, evenly heating on each side of the cap and not dwelling in one place for too long. You will sometimes get smoke lifting off of the plastics on the cap as that melts. As with any rework or soldering, try to keep your area well ventilated so that you're not breathing in all of those toxic fumes. Once the caps are removed, I'll have another clean up and then prepare the pads for the new caps to go on. I'll remove any old solder with some braid, and any excess flux from the removal process will still be helping here to get things moving, but you will want to then give that all a good clean up and make sure that the pads are clear. And then the new caps go on. Now, I'd be interested to hear your approach to this, but mine is to touch some solder onto one pad and then heat that solder and slide the cap into it, making sure it's nice and flush to the board, and then touch some solder on the other pad. It just seems to work for me doing it that way. It's a bit fiddly and it can seem a bit daunting when compared to pulling out through-hole capacitors, but once you've done a few you can work through them quite quickly, even more quickly than the through-hole capacitors. It's just a case of doing your prep and being careful not to damage surrounding components. Now, this will take me some time, so while I'm doing it, I'm delighted to say that I had the absolute privilege of talking to former senior engineer at Commodore, Dave Haney, who worked on the Amiga 4000 and surrounding projects before and after, and will give us an insight now from the inside of Commodore, exactly what was happening, where the machine came from, and what the culture and experience was like in the company for an engineer at the time. So let's see what he has to say.
I'm Dave Haney. I was one of the senior engineers at Commodore, and in fact I was the guy working on the advanced project stuff. So after the 3000, I started working on a thing we called the Amiga 3000 Plus, which was the first debut of what we called at the time the Pandora chips, which later got dubbed the AA chips internally because we had been previously working on the AAA chips, the Advanced Amiga Architecture, which was one that didn't actually do anything until about 1993. And then the marketing people dubbed it AGA because it sounded like VGA. While I was working on the 3000 plus, Greg Berlin and Scott Schaefer, who are both A3000 people, got tasked on building something that was being dubbed the Amiga 2200 and 3200. I mean, yeah, 2200 and 3400, which were really just cut down A3000s with regular chipset, and they were only going to do Zorro 2 expansion, and the 2200 was 2 slots and the 3400 was 4 slots, and they kind of looked like what the A4000 eventually looked like. Commodore had this weird system where the engineering and the central management of the company was one thing, but each marketing and sales company ran kind of as a separate division with a lot of autonomy. So Amiga 2200, Amiga 3400 come up, and nobody wants to buy one. Because they had all heard about the AGA chips, Pandora chips, whatever you want to call them, and that's what they wanted. So the management did a mad scramble and said, we must produce a AA machine, and so that's where the A4000 came from. The 3000 Plus was booting Amiga OS in February of 1991. It was taking a while to get the software up and running to exploit all the regular stuff, but I had actually had the thing in the lab, and I had hand coded some demos that used the 256 colors and the other stuff you could do with it, just to show that it worked. So yeah, it had been ready. It was a weird situation where the hardware was actually ready, like a long time before the software had gotten up and running. But also because of the management shifts and everything, that's why it was first booting. In fact, it would have booted in January, except the first version of the Alice chip had some bug in it where we couldn't get any output on this. But it wasn't delivering the right video DMA or something like that. But it was pretty easy. I mean, the chip guys looked at it and like, oh yeah, okay, next Rev will fix it, and it did. And it wasn't actually that problematic. It kind of just worked.
So knowing what we do now about those projects as you've described them, would it be fair to say that the Amiga 4000 is a cost-reduced Amiga 3000 Plus?
It was kind of mixing the two. It took the 3400 cost reductions, then added a lot of the 3000 Plus DNA back into it to make it a reasonable machine. They didn't put SCSI in. The 3000 Plus still had all the regular A3000 stuff, so it had that cheap IDE that they threw in there, and that was because. I mean, I'm sure it saved a little money on drives because just, the PC was everything at that point, but it was mostly because the guy who had been running Commodore engineering at the time, Bill Sidney's, had been a PC guy. So everything he saw was through a PC lens. So if you weren't using a regular PC component, there must be something wrong with you. Bill Sidney's was kind of this guy that was brought in because they had some dirt on him or something. I don't really know, but I mean, he had been the guy responsible for the Franklin computer debacle, where they were basically just Xeroxing the Apple II ROM in their Apple II clone. He had been responsible for the PC Junior at IBM. Not exactly an illustrious career. So, I don't know if he. I don't know exactly why they brought him in, but they needed somebody to run the company, and they decided that they were kicking Henry Rubin out and kind of sidelining Jeff Porter, and that was the management team that brought you the 3000, the A500, and we hadn't actually been doing anything wrong with those guys. In fact, Jeff Porter was the one who kept the A3000 Plus alive as long as he did. Within Commodore. I mean, it's like, you're scrambling for resources, and somebody has to sign the paper that says I get to make this new board or whatever. And before that, it was a real good place to work before that. There was this thing called Getting Henried, where Henry would come along and have this mission for you that he decided you needed that day. And so, like, some days Henry might come along and say, David, I have this, I need this new upgrade I just heard you came out with. And I'm like, well, Henry, it's really still in the lab. But he always had to have the fastest Amiga in his office. And so that actually, that won over a lot with me, because here was the guy who was running engineering, who tried to do as much as he possibly could on an Amiga, even though he was supposed to be this business guy. And, most of the business guys are PC guys, right? On the other hand, he had been an engineer, and he would come to me and say, maybe it's time we do a revision of the chip or something like that. It wasn't like I had to come to them and say, I can't get any further. He's like, well, you're gonna, and we discuss it. And Jeff was great. He was not only running things, he was the guy who figured out how to make the A500 for $600, which was an accomplishment considering the original Amiga 1000 did the same thing. When Sidney's came in and basically the PC people took over engineering, it was really depressing. I mean, a lot of people left. And I was kind of tempted. In 91, I was, I didn't know what I was going to do, because they were canceling all my projects. And because of management-based decisions, when we started shipping AA machines, they couldn't make enough, because we hadn't ordered enough chips. Because the Alice chip was made at Commodore. The Lisa chip could only be made at least at the time when we started, at Hewlett-Packard. And that was really before. That's really back when there weren't that many people trying to do silicon without owning a fab. And Commodore, of course, had a fab. It just, we hadn't gotten 1 micron CMOS up and running. In fact, they eventually got that chip working in 1.5 micron CMOS at Commodore, I think. But it was, at least initially, we had to have Hewlett-Packard make it for us. And they were a real company that needed, first of all, to be paid. Secondly, they needed the order in enough time for the chips to actually be made based on their scheduling. And they had been, they had spent all of 1991 basically trying to make this thing go away. So, and like I said, even at the beginning of 92, we had this 2200 and 3400 that weren't using these chips. Then all of a sudden we needed them, but they weren't there. So as I heard it, you couldn't buy a 1200 at Christmas of 92. You couldn't buy an A4000, but all the A600s you'd ever want. It was kind of the same thing next year with the CD32. They made CD32s, and a lot of people wanted them, but they had, at that point, they didn't even have any money left. So they were out of credit, having to pay cash for everything, and it's that downward spiral thing. You screw up this year, next year's even harder. I had all these ideas for where we were going after A3000, A4000, that I think we could have built some really nice machines. We had a plan to be able to move into whatever came after 68,000, which we weren't quite sure what it was going to be, because there were some people who liked the Alpha processor, there were some people who liked PA RISC, there were some people who liked, because PA RISC was being used in the Ombre. It's only because Dr. Ed Hepler made his own PA RISC processor core. And then there was PowerPC, which for a while looked like it was going to be a thing, until it kind of, by 97, and once it had been sucked back into Apple, it was guaranteed to fail. But before then, it looked like that might be the next big thing in personal computing. So, what I had been doing was trying to make everything as open architecture as possible, so, Commodore could follow whichever direction was best after the 68,000 family had run out, because I knew that the thing that came after the A4000 I expected was going to be that transition machine wherever it went. Unfortunately, little did I know that it was the 4000 and the 3000 that were going to be the transition machine, because that's, the last ones that left standing, right?
In the early 90s, Commodore was under a certain amount of financial pressure, so whoever was running the company was going to have to make some potentially unpopular decisions. As it happens, that man was Mehdi Ali, and he does come under a lot of flack for the decisions that he made. Does he deserve that, or would it have been the same for anyone that came into the company?
Yeah, I think he does, because, basically he looked at everything as, what are we going to cut? He didn't look at any, he didn't have any idea of, spending money to make money, which of course is the fundamental basis of engineering. If you're not spending money to make the next product, people will stop buying the product you make today, and what are you going to do, right? And then years later, I heard that apparently Jean-Louis Gasset from Apple, who eventually went on to make the B computer and operating system, had approached Commodore and wanted to run engineering. And all he asked was that he got to control Commodore for 3 years, because that was exactly what it was going to take to turn everything around. It was like, stop messing with things that, from an engineering point of view, you can make something happen in a year. But from a market perspective, to change things around, you can't fix something in just 1 year. And that's about the time, until Medi came along, that's about the time that Irving Gould gave anybody who had tried previously. That they just weren't allowed the time to turn Commodore around, even whether it was international or in the U.S. And so then each guy comes in and spends 6 months trying to figure out what the other guy was doing. It was just hard. It had been managed horribly for a while. It just really hadn't affected us until they started messing with engineering. So, other than the fact we weren't getting the budgets we needed. Now, when I'm doing system level stuff, I'm making a new motherboard or something, whatever chips I got, I'm going to put down there. I can add some stuff to improve things like the DSP or whatever. That's not super, super expensive. Making new chips was the expensive part. And that's really where, unfortunately, that had been Commodore's strength. And when you weren't continuing with that, when you weren't making, the AA chips that we started in 1988, if they had been done in 1990, they would have been revolutionary. If they'd been done in 92, they would have been pretty good. By 94, other people were, that's really when we needed the Ombre chip, which was the next generation beyond that was a true GPU that we could have had maybe in 1994 if things had been happening perfect. And nobody had an actual GPU in 1994. So, we had all the right minds and all the right people doing the right stuff. It's just, if you're not, chips take a certain amount of time to build and test and revise, and it's a lot of money, and, more people, things could have been completely different. Now, I think eventually Commodore would have had to either start selling chips to everybody or stop making them bought NVIDIA or something like that, because you didn't see anybody who was surviving. Even if Commodore had gotten up to Apple's level and was selling 6 million or 7 million computers a year, that wasn't enough to keep going forever, on a GPU kind of thing, because they just kept getting bigger and bigger. They eventually became as complicated as CPUs, maybe even a little more so. But there was a time, and who knows what could have happened. Maybe Commodore splits that off as a separate company, or maybe they merge with some other graphics company. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that could have happened if we were still seen as being in the leading edge of this stuff in the 90s.
And thank you so much to Dave, who has agreed to come back for a longer chat at some time about his whole life in computing, so we can do a retro tea break interview with him soon. So after recapping the Amiga, you can see that it's still working, thankfully. I tested it with one stick of RAM at a time so as not to overcomplicate things if problems cropped up, but it was all good. And then I put all of the RAM sticks in and loaded up Workbench, and it has detected all of that RAM. So all we have to do now then is clean up that filthy case, put it all back together, throw in some upgrades along the way, and we can see what our final Amiga 4000 looks like. So let's get to cleaning. This Amiga is so grubby it's hard to tell if the plastics have yellowed or not under all of that filth. So I started with the front fascia and removed some kind of sticker residue that's on there. I like to start with the least harsh methods for removal and work my way up. So I doused it in WD-40 and left it for 10 minutes to soak, as this often loosens up stickers. That unfortunately didn't shift it all, so I moved on to some Sif, or Jif for viewers of a certain vintage, which got a little more of it off, but this was really stubborn. So I moved on to some alcohol, and that got the last of it to shift. If that hadn't worked, then some gentle heating would have got it moving, and beyond that some acetone, but if you use that, then you need to make sure that you get all of it off of the plastic, as it can be quite aggressive to it. The rest of the fascia just needed some good old soap and water, and you can see it's coming up really nicely. I find that some Amiga 600, 1200 and 4000s just don't seem to yellow like the others in the range. Sometimes you'll get the keys on the keyboard yellowing, but not the case, which makes it look like it needs to go to the dentist. And sometimes the whole thing yellows, so I don't know if Commodore were playing with their process halfway through manufacturing. It just seems to be a thing. Now, some of the metalwork on the case I thought could look a lot better, so I attacked that with some metal polish, which we rub on and leave for 10 minutes to go to work, and then we buff it off. I'm using Brasso here. You can repeat the process as many times as you like to bring it up looking nicely. And here's a reminder of what it looked like before. And there it is after. Nice and simple and much nicer in my opinion. And then we move on to the remaining plastics and the case itself, making sure to get right into the grooves of the power switch here with the toothbrush and dig out all of the grot that's built up in there. That's looking good. And the case itself got a wipe down with soap and water and then some more Sif to shift the more stubborn stains on it. And it really did continue to please me just how nicely this is coming up, both inside and out. There's no special skills needed here, just patience, soap, water and elbow grease. You'll remember when we first met this machine that it had some paper stuck to its foot, and that's because the plastics for the feet have perished. There's a chemical reaction that's happened over the years, turning it into a sticky, gooey mess. So we'll need to get that fixed. I've popped off the old foot here and replaced it with a brand new one. And that's a satisfyingly good fit, isn't it? And for reference, these are 3M 200MP acrylic adhesives. And of course, we'll put them on all four corners. Lovely new shoes for our Amiga 4000. And then we can start reconstructing the Amiga and upgrading it as we go. Now, an upgrade I found really useful on all of my Amigas is the 3.14 Kickstart upgrade, primarily because it lets me use hard drive partitions larger than 4GB nice and easily. So in they go, we've got a high and a low ROM, with the high on the right of the picture. Another nice easy upgrade now. Why don't we give our 68030 CPU a maths coprocessor to help with some number crunching? And that's as easy as dropping in a 68882 floating point unit into the inviting empty socket, making sure we've got it correctly aligned and then pushing it in. It's as simple as that. Jumper J100 next to it should be set to pins 1 and 2 to make use of the FPU, and then we'll check that it's in operation later when we run sysinfo. I really do like the ease with which CPUs can be swapped out on the 4000, and even though the CPU is soldered on later system boards in the cost-reduced 4000, the slot does remain on those ones and can be used, so it's a really nice feature. I'll keep saying it, but just look how lovely and clean and white that case is looking. Now notice as I put the PSU in, there's another upgrade I fitted on the right hand side. That's an IDE compact flash adapter instead of the old broken hard drives, and it makes it nice and easy to have multiple cards to swap in and out for different configurations for the machine. Next up, I ran into an odd problem. My floppy drive didn't fit. Look at the gap there, and that was terribly confusing. Well, it turns out, while testing the machine on the workbench, I'd mixed up the original floppy drive with another in the lab area, which worked just fine, but clearly doesn't belong here. So I went and found the correct one, which needed a clean of course, and I'm glad I checked inside it because I found wedged in there at the back of the drive a national insurance card. Now I've pixelated this for obvious reasons, but I can tell you it belongs to someone called Gwen. Perhaps some mischievous children poked it in there. I mean, I once put a saucer into a VCR as a kid. That's what kids do, right? And that's much better. No more gap around our floppy drive. And let's just take a moment again to see how new that case looks after a clean. It's a really fine looking example of a 4000. Here it is before, and here it is again after, paired up with a Philips CM8833 monitor, and I've got an external Gotek floppy emulator to bring us into the 21st century. And there it is, all working and in action with a game of 4D sports driving, putting it through its paces. And then I followed that up with a game of the enhanced AGA version of Civilization to bang on that newer enhanced Amiga hardware and the AGA chipset. Here it is then, the fruits of our labour. Who would have thought that underneath that dirt and grime we would have what looks practically like a brand new Amiga 4000. I think it looks incredible. I'm really pleased with how it's come up. Now, you may be thinking, why is this the end of the series? Surely we can do a lot more with this. You can upgrade it more. You can show us more. Well, I've got some good reasons for that. First of all, let's talk about the upgrades. I did some very minor upgrades to this. There are more upgrades to bring it kicking and screaming into the 21st century and make it more convenient to use. With the compact flash card, with the Gotek, and then the FPU is just a nice touch. I had one lying around. It will cost you less than £10 to get a hold of that FPU and pop it in, so why wouldn't you? So I'm pretty happy with those upgrades when you consider that not so long ago we built the Amiga 500++ with a Vampire on there. And I also have tucked away a 68060 card for an Amiga 1200 for when we come to do a Trash to Treasure on my beaten up old Amiga 1200. So I don't have a huge need to spend hundreds, and it really does cost hundreds of pounds to get a 68040 or a 68060 for this machine. Pretty happy with how it is. We could get a bit more RAM for it, but 8 meg is all I need really for what I'm going to be doing on it, which is installing Workbench, setting up WHD load, and putting a big library of games on there, which you're going to hate me for because the 4000 is not made for gaming. There is one other upgrade, which I haven't put it in, and I'll explain why. This comes from Amiga Passion. They were really helpful in helping me to source this. Steve at Amiga Fashion. Amiga Fashion sounds good. Steve at Amiga Passion. Because this is a scan doubler, and I couldn't find one. It's a scan plus AGA, which is suitable for a 1200 or a 4000, and they were just out of stock everywhere. Oh, look, we've got a Chupa Chups lollipop in there as well. And the reason I haven't put this in yet is part and parcel of what I'm about to tell you next. So, we are about to be either the victim of one of the worst hoaxes ever, or the recipient of the greatest act of generosity this cave has ever seen. I've been contacted from a gentleman who wants to remain anonymous and says that he is sending an Amiga 4000 video toaster with all the extras to the cave. Now, the video toaster, if you don't know, is an add-on from a company called NewTek back in the day, and it was an alternative to spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on video editing and special effects equipment so that lower cost studios could actually do all of that stuff. And it appeared in commercial releases. You know, the work done on the Amiga 4000 video toaster appeared in the original Babylon 5 series. So it was capable of producing some really high quality stuff at the time. Now, I would much rather show you that in action than show you me playing games, as we've seen on lots of other Amigas in the past. The same games, a bit faster, some AGA games with a few more colours. I'm sure you'd much rather see that video productivity stuff than me doing that. So that's why I'm saving this, because I might want to put it in there, and you'll either get a video where we get to explore that after an unboxing video, or you'll get a video of me simply sobbing on the desk. We'll see how it pans out. So that's why we're stopping here and now. I'm really happy with what we've done with this. I think it's a great refurbishment. And there's one other thing. We've got a great big gap here where there should be a keyboard. Let's work some magic. And there it is. The keyboard has arrived. This is a wonderful donation from cave dweller Katrina over in Germany, who sent this over to us. These are really hard to get hold of, so I really do appreciate it, Katrina. And it just finishes everything off beautifully, reunites everything, and makes me very proud of this Amiga 4000. Thank you, Katrina. We should, though, run sysinfo just so we can see how this machine's performing. First up, we can see that the 8 meg of RAM is detected in sysinfo, so that's good to see. And then if we run the all-important speed test and wait for the results to pop up, unsurprisingly, it detects itself as being a little bit faster than an Amiga 3000 with the same 68030 CPU in, because of course we've added the FPU. So it just goes to show this isn't a vast improvement on the original 3000 when it comes to raw processing power. Over here we can see that the AGA chipset and indeed that 68882 FPU is detected, and sysinfo is impressed because it gives the comment, "Cowabunga." Thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series. Huge thank you to Dave Haney, to David Pleasance for their input into this series. And this is not the last we'll see of the Amiga 4000. Fingers crossed. See you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.